Ma'am, this is first class, you're not supposed to be here. The words landed softly, but they hit Sophie Bennett like a spotlight snapping on in a dark room, and for a split second, every eye within 3 rows seemed to turn toward her, judging, measuring, deciding exactly where she belonged, and it definitely wasn't here. Sophie froze halfway into her seat, her worn canvas bag clutched against her chest, her fingers still wrapped around the armrest like she might be asked to disappear if she let go, and maybe she would, because everything about this moment felt like a mistake she couldn't afford. She blinked up at the flight attendant, her voice caught somewhere between apology and panic. I'm sorry, I thought this was seat 2A, she said, glancing down at her crumpled boarding pass, the ink slightly smudged from being folded and unfolded too many times, a clear print of economy class staring back at her like a quiet accusation. Her cheeks burned as she started to stand, already imagining the long walk down the aisle, past polished shoes and tailored suits, back to the place she was actually meant to be, back to reality, back to everything she was trying to outrun. It's okay, a calm voice said beside her, low, steady, and completely unexpected, and when Sophie turned, she found herself looking into the kind of face that didn't belong in her world either, sharp features softened by a quiet confidence, dark hair perfectly in place, and eyes that didn't look annoyed or amused, just, observant. She can stay, he added, his tone casual, like he was commenting on the weather, but there was something in it that made the flight attendant pause. Sir, I'm afraid, I invited her, he said, without raising his voice, without looking away from Sophie, and just like that, the tension shifted, subtle but undeniable, the kind of shift Sophie had only ever seen from the outside, never from the center. The attendant hesitated, then nodded politely, offering Sophie a tight smile before stepping back. Enjoy your flight. Sophie sat there, stunned, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure the man next to her could hear it, and for a moment, she didn't move, didn't speak. Didn't breathe properly, because none of this made sense. You didn't have to do that, she finally said, her voice quieter now, careful, like she was stepping onto thin ice. The man leaned back slightly in his seat, completely at ease, as if this kind of moment happened to him every day. You looked like you needed a break, he replied, simple, direct, no hint of expectation in his tone, and that somehow made it more confusing. Sophie let out a small, nervous laugh, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Yeah, well, this isn't really my world, she admitted, glancing around at the wide leather seats, the soft lighting, the quiet hum of people who didn't have to think twice about where they Saturday. Maybe not, he said, but you're here now. She didn't know what to say to that, so instead, she looked down at her bag, pulling out her sketchbook without thinking, the edges worn, the pages filled with half-finished drawings and ideas she never quite had time to finish, and she traced her fingers over the top page, grounding herself in something familiar. Long flight, he asked. Depends on how you look at it, she replied, glancing at him again, a little more curious this time. It's about 6 hours, but it kind of feels like everything is riding on it. He tilted his head slightly, interested now. That important? She nodded, swallowing the knot in her throat. Job interview. Last shot, really. If this doesn't work out, she trailed off, not finishing the sentence, because she didn't need to, not out loud. He didn't push. Then I guess it has to work out, he said instead, and there was something steady in the way he said it, something that made it sound less like hope and more like a quiet decision. Sophie studied him for a second, trying to place him, trying to understand why someone like him would care whether she stayed in a seat she didn't belong in, why he'd step in so easily, like it cost him nothing, when for her, everything always came with a price. Why'd you help me? She asked, more direct now, her eyes searching his face for something real. He smiled, just slightly, not the kind of smile that showed off, but the kind that suggested he knew more than he was saying. Let's just say. I'm interested in people, he answered, and for a moment, Sophie didn't realize she'd just become one of them, someone being quietly observed, carefully understood, without even knowing it. Outside the window, the plane began to move, the runway stretching out ahead like a line between two different versions of her life, and as the engines roared to life, Sophie tightened her grip on her sketchbook, unaware that this seat, this mistake, this stranger beside her, was about to change everything she thought she knew about where she belonged, and more importantly, who she really was. The plane leveled out above the clouds, the soft hum of the engine settling into a steady rhythm that almost felt like calm, but Sophie Bennett could still feel the tension lingering in her chest, like she was waiting for someone to tap her shoulder and tell her this had all been a mistake that needed correcting, and yet no one did, and the man beside her, still composed, still quietly observing, seemed completely unbothered by the invisible line she had just crossed by sitting here. A flight attendant returned, this time with a polite smile that felt practiced but less guarded, placing a glass of sparkling water in front of Sophie as if she belonged, and for a brief second, Sophie hesitated before touching it, as though even accepting it might somehow expose her, but the man beside her gave a small nod, almost encouraging, and she finally picked it up, her fingers still slightly tense around the glass. "First time up here?" he asked, his voice carrying that same calm tone, not mocking, not impressed, just curious. Sophie let out a quiet breath, a small smile forming despite herself. "Is it that obvious?" she replied, glancing at the menu in front of her like it was written in another language. "Only because you are actually reading the fine print," he said, and there was a hint of humor in his eyes now, something warmer, something that made her relax just a little more. She shook her head lightly. "I just want to make sure I do not accidentally order something that costs more than my rent," she said, half joking, half serious, and the honesty of it hung in the air for a second before she realized she had said too much. But he did not react the way she expected. He did not look surprised or uncomfortable. Instead, he leaned back slightly, considering her words. "And if you could," he asked. "If you could order anything without worrying about the price, what would you choose?" Sophie paused, the question catching her off guard, because it was not really about the menu, and she knew it. She looked down at her sketchbook again, flipping it open absent-mindedly, revealing a page filled with pencil lines, a city skyline unfinished, with light breaking through in places she had not yet shaded. "Honestly," she said quietly, "I would not choose anything different. I would just enjoy it without feeling guilty about it." The man watched her closely, his expression unreadable for a moment, as if he was measuring something deeper than her answer. "That is rare," he said finally. "Most people would say they want more." Sophie shrugged slightly, tracing a line on the page with her finger. "Wanting more is easy. Knowing what is enough is harder." The word seemed to land somewhere between them, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, the silence not awkward but filled with something unspoken, something that felt like the beginning of understanding. Then, almost casually, the man reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet, letting it slip from his hand onto the floor as if by accident. It landed just near Sophie's feet, the leather catching a bit of light as it fell open slightly, revealing a glimpse of neatly arranged cards and cash. Sophie noticed immediately, her eyes flicking down, then back up to him, but he did not react, did not even glance at it, as if he had not realized. For a second, Sophie hesitated, the moment stretching just long enough for the thought to cross her mind that no one else had seen it, that it would be easy to ignore, easy to pretend she had not noticed, but something in her tightened at the idea. She leaned down, picking it up carefully, closing it before handing it back to him. "You dropped this," she said simply. He took it from her, their fingers brushing briefly. And for the first time, there was a flicker of something in his expression, something almost like confirmation. "Thank you," he said, his voice softer now. Sophie gave a small nod, turning her attention back to her sketchbook, but the moment lingered, subtle but important, like something had just been quietly decided without being spoken aloud. A few minutes later, as the meal service began, a minor commotion unfolded a few rows ahead, a passenger raising his voice slightly at a flight attendant over a delayed order, his tone sharp enough to draw attention but not enough to cause a scene, and Sophie's eyes shifted instinctively, watching as the attendant tried to remain composed. The man beside her glanced in that direction as well, then back at Sophie, as if waiting. Sophie hesitated again, then leaned slightly forward, catching the attendant's eye when she passed. "Hey," Sophie said gently, offering a small smile. "You are doing great. Do not worry about it. It was a simple thing, almost nothing, but the relief in the attendant's expression was immediate, a quiet thank you passing between them before she moved on. Sophie sat back, unaware that the man beside her had been watching not just what she did, but how naturally she did it, without hesitation, without expectation of anything in return. You did not have to do that, he said quietly. Sophie shrugged, her eyes returning to the clouds outside the window. I know, she replied. That is kind of the point. He studied her again, deeper this time, as if every small action was adding up to something larger, something he had been searching for, and as the plane carried them forward, high above everything familiar, Sophie had no idea that each quiet choice she made was being carefully remembered, not for what it was worth in that moment, but for what it revealed about who she truly was when she thought no one important was watching. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight settled into its long cruise, and somewhere between the quiet clink of glasses and the soft murmur of conversations, Sophie Bennet began to forget, just a little, that she was sitting somewhere she was never meant to be, and that feeling alone was unfamiliar enough to make her pause and take it in, like she was borrowing a version of life she had only ever seen through windows. Beside her, the man remained composed, his attention drifting between her sketchbook and the endless stretch of clouds outside, but there was something deliberate in the way he stayed present, like he was not just passing time, but observing it, collecting it. Can I ask you something? He said after a while, his voice quieter now, more intentional. Sophie glanced up from her sketchbook, her pencil hovering midline. You already have, she replied lightly, though there was curiosity in her tone. He smiled faintly. Fair point. Let me try again. What are you really hoping happens when you land? The question was simple, but it reached deeper than she expected, and for a moment, Sophie did not answer. She looked down at the page in front of her, at the unfinished skyline, at the blank spaces she had not yet decided how to fill, and she let out a slow breath. I hope someone looks at me and sees more than what I am right now, she said finally, her voice softer, more honest than before. Not just the job title, not just the bank account, not just where I came from. She hesitated, then added, I just want a chance to prove I can be more. The man watched her carefully, his expression unreadable, but something shifted in his eyes, something that looked almost like recognition. And if they do not? He asked. Sophie gave a small shrug, though there was strength behind it now. Then I keep going until someone does. Or until I become someone I do not need approval from. The answer lingered between them, heavier this time, and for a brief second, the world outside the plane felt very far away, like they were suspended in a space where truth came easier than usual. He leaned back slightly, studying her as if she had just confirmed something he had been quietly testing all along. You do not seem like someone who would compromise easily, he said. Sophie let out a small laugh, shaking her head. I compromise all the time, she admitted. Rent, food, jobs I do not love, that is life. But there are some things you just do. Not trade, no matter how hard it gets. He tilted his head, interested. Like what? She paused, then closed her sketchbook gently, resting her hand on top of it as if grounding herself before answering. How you treat people when there is nothing to gain, she said. That is the one thing you cannot fake for long. The words landed with quiet certainty, and this time, he did not respond right away. Instead, he reached for the glass of water in front of him, taking a slow sip, his gaze drifting toward the aisle as if considering something beyond the conversation. A few rows back, a man in a tailored suit was speaking loudly into his phone, his tone sharp, impatient, the kind of voice that expected the world to adjust itself around him, and Sophie noticed the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the way people nearby pretended not to hear, the way the flight attendants moved a little more carefully in that direction. The man beside her followed her gaze, then looked back at her, a question unspoken but clear. Sophie hesitated, just for a moment, then stood up quietly, stepping into the aisle with a calmness she did not entirely feel. She walked a few steps back, her movements respectful, careful not to interrupt directly, but when the man paused between sentences, she leaned slightly closer, her voice polite but steady. Hey, I think your call is carrying a bit, she said gently. Some people are trying to rest. The man blinked, caught off guard, his expression shifting from irritation to mild embarrassment as he glanced around, realizing the attention he had drawn. Right, he muttered, lowering his voice almost immediately before ending the call. Sophie gave a small nod, then returned to her seat without making it a bigger moment than it needed to be. When she sat down again, the man beside her was watching her differently now, not just curious, but almost impressed, though he did not say it directly. Most people would have ignored that, he said instead. Sophie shrugged lightly, reaching for her sketchbook again. Most people are tired, she replied. And sometimes it is easier to stay quiet than to say something that might make things uncomfortable. She glanced at him briefly, then added, but that does not make it right. He held her gaze for a second longer than before, something deeper settling behind his expression, something that suggested this was no longer just a conversation, but a confirmation of everything he had been quietly testing since the moment she sat down. Outside the window, the sky stretched endlessly, bright and open, and for Sophie, the future still felt uncertain, still filled with questions she did not yet have answers to, but for the first time in a long while, she did not feel small inside it, and she had no idea that the man sitting beside her was already beginning to see her not as someone who had taken the wrong seat, but as someone who might just belong in places she had never imagined, places that would soon reveal themselves in ways she could not yet understand. Hours passed in a strange, suspended rhythm, where time no longer felt like something Sophie Bennett was racing against but something she was quietly moving through, one conversation, one thought at a time, and somewhere between the meal trays being cleared and the cabin lights dimming further, she realized she had stopped thinking about how she did not belong here and started wondering why the man beside her seemed so interested in whether she did. He had not introduced himself properly, not in any way that explained who he was or what he did, and yet there was a quiet authority in everything about him, in the way people subtly adjusted around him, in the way the flight attendants spoke just a little more carefully when they addressed him, and Sophie noticed it now, not as intimidation, but as a quiet pattern that did not quite match the version of him he had shown her. You never told me your name, she said finally, closing her sketchbook again, her curiosity no longer something she felt the need to hide. He glanced at her, a small pause before answering, as if choosing how much to reveal. Alexander, he said, simple, no last name, no title, just a single word that somehow still carried weight. Sophie, she replied, offering a small smile, though part of her wondered if he already knew that somehow. Nice to officially meet you. He nodded slightly. Likewise. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but it was different now, more aware, more intentional, like both of them understood that whatever this was had moved past casual conversation into something that mattered, even if neither of them had defined it yet. So what do you do, Alexander? Sophie asked, her tone light but her eyes searching, because something about him did not fit neatly into any category she knew. He leaned back slightly, considering the question, his gaze drifting briefly toward the window before returning to her. I study people, he said. Sophie raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement crossing her face. That sounds vague on purpose, she replied. He allowed a small smile. It is. She laughed softly, shaking her head. Okay, mysterious. I will take that as you do something complicated and do not feel like explaining it. Something like that, he said, not correcting her, but not confirming either, and that only made her more certain that there was more beneath the surface than he was willing to show. A few minutes later, the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing that they would begin their descent in about 45 minutes, and the shift in the cabin was immediate, people adjusting their seats, gathering their belongings, preparing to return to whatever lives were waiting for them on the ground. Sophie felt it too, that subtle tightening in her chest, the reminder that this moment was temporary, that whatever strange, unexpected connection had formed up here would likely disappear the moment the plane landed, replaced by reality, by responsibilities, by the version of herself that did not sit in first class. She reached into her bag, pulling out her wallet to check what little she had left, the thin stack of bills folded carefully, every dollar already accounted for in her mind, rent, food, transportation, the job interview that could change everything or nothing at all, and as she counted quietly, she did not notice the way Alexander's eyes flicked briefly to the amount, not in judgment, but in quiet acknowledgement of the reality she carried with her. Then, as if on cue, a man across the aisle leaned slightly into the space between seats, his tone casual but edged with something less polite. "You know this section is not for everyone, right?" he said, his gaze lingering on Sophie just a second too long, the implication clear even if the words were not outright rude. Sophie stiffened slightly, her fingers tightening around her wallet, the old instinct to shrink, to apologize, to make herself smaller rising quickly, but before she could respond, Alexander turned his head, his expression calm but firm in a way that shifted the entire energy of the moment. "And yet she is here," he said, his voice even, not raised, but carrying a quiet authority that made the other man pause. "Maybe focus on your own seat." The man blinked, caught off guard, then leaned back without another word, the tension dissolving as quickly as it had appeared. Sophie exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing just a fraction, though the familiar sting of being judged lingered beneath the surface. "You did not have to do that," she said quietly, not looking at him this time. "I know," Alexander replied, echoing her words from earlier, and there was something intentional in the way he said it, something that made her glance up at him again. "But that is kind of the point, right?" he added, a faint hint of a smile returning. Sophie studied him for a moment, then let out a small breath, something softer replacing the tension in her expression. "You have been doing that a lot," she said. "Stepping in when you do not have to." He held her gaze, steady, thoughtful. "I am interested in seeing what people do when it matters," he said. "And sometimes, that means being part of the moment." She did not fully understand what he meant, not yet, but something about the way he said it stayed with her, like a piece of a puzzle she did not realize she was already part of. Outside the window, the clouds began to thin, the first hints of the city appearing below, streets and buildings slowly coming into focus, and as the plane started its descent, Sophie felt the weight of reality returning, the interview, the uncertainty, the life waiting for her on the ground, but now, layered over it was something new, something unexpected, the sense that this flight, this mistake, this stranger named Alexander, had already changed something inside her, even if she could not yet see how far that change would go once they landed. The wheels touched down with a smooth, controlled thud, and as the plane slowed along the runway, Sophie Bennett felt the quiet bubble of the last few hours begin to dissolve, replaced by the familiar weight of reality pressing back in, steady and unavoidable, like gravity reminding her where she truly belonged, and yet something inside her resisted that idea now, something subtle but undeniable that had shifted during the flight. Around her, people were already turning their phones back on, gathering their belongings with practiced ease, slipping back into lives that looked as polished as the seats they had just occupied, and Sophie followed their lead, carefully placing her sketchbook back into her bag, double-checking her wallet, making sure nothing had been lost in a place that never really felt like hers to begin with. Beside her, Alexander remained calm, unhurried, as if time moved differently for him, and when he finally reached for his jacket, it was with the same quiet precision that had defined everything he had done since she met him. "This is where things usually change," he said suddenly, his voice low enough that only she could hear it over the movement of the cabin. Sophie glanced at him, confused. "What do you mean?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment, something thoughtful in his expression, like he was deciding how much truth to give her before everything shifted. "People act one way when they think no one is watching," he said. "And another when they think everything matters." Sophie frowned slightly, trying to follow, but before she could ask more, the seatbelt sign turned off, and the aisle filled quickly with passengers eager to stand, to move, to leave, and the moment slipped away before it could fully form. When it was their turn, Sophie stood carefully, adjusting the strap of her bag over her shoulder, her eyes briefly meeting Alexander's again, and for a second, neither of them spoke, as if both understood that whatever this connection was, it had an expiration point the moment they stepped off the plane. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice sincere, not just for the seat, but for everything that had come with it. He nodded slightly, his gaze steady. "You did not need me," he replied. You just needed the opportunity. The words stayed with her as they moved slowly down the aisle, past rows of people who barely noticed them, past the invisible line that separated first class from the rest of the plane, and Sophie felt it again, that quiet shift, not in where she was, but in how she saw herself moving through it. At the exit, a flight attendant smiled warmly at her, wishing her a good day in a tone that felt just a little more genuine than before, and Sophie returned the smile without hesitation this time, stepping out into the jet bridge where the air felt cooler, sharper, more real. For a few steps, she walked beside Alexander, the silence between them no longer awkward, but heavy with everything that had not been said, and then, as the hallway opened into the terminal, it happened all at once. A man in a tailored suit approached quickly, his expression focused, his voice urgent but controlled. "Mr. Cole, the car is ready. The press is already asking questions, and the team is waiting for your statement," he said, barely glancing at Sophie as he spoke. Sophie slowed slightly, the words not fully registering at first, but then another person joined, holding a tablet, speaking in quick, efficient tones. "We have the footage queued, and the preliminary edits look strong. This could trend within hours if we release it today. Footage. Edits. Statement." The pieces began to shift in Sophie's mind, rearranging into something that felt too structured to be coincidence, and when she turned to look at Alexander, she saw something she had not seen before, not just calm, not just observant, but prepared, like this moment had always been waiting on the other side of the flight. "Alexander Cole," she repeated quietly, the name settling into place with a weight that made her chest tighten. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time. There was no distance in his expression, no carefully measured response, just a quiet acknowledgement that the truth had arrived. "Yes," he said simply. Sophie's eyes flicked between him and the people now gathering around him, the subtle shift in how they stood, how they spoke, how the space itself seemed to bend around his presence, and suddenly, everything made sense in a way that felt both clear and overwhelming at the same time. The way he had intervened. The questions he had asked. The way he had watched her, not casually, but carefully, like every answer, every action had mattered more than she realized. "You were not just observing," she said, her voice quieter now, steadier than she felt. "You were testing." It was not really a question, and he did not deny it. "I was trying to understand what people value when they think it does not matter," he replied, his tone calm, but there was something beneath it now, something that felt less distant, more personal. Sophie let out a slow breath, the realization settling deeper with each passing second, and for a moment, she did not know whether to feel impressed, angry, or something in between. "So what was I?" she asked, meeting his eyes directly now. "Just another example." The people around him shifted slightly, waiting, watching, but Alexander did not look away from her. "No," he said quietly. "You were the answer." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than anything else he had said, and Sophie felt something twist inside her, not because she did not understand what he meant, but because she was not sure she wanted to be part of something that had been designed to measure her without her knowing. Around them, the airport continued moving, announcements echoing overhead, footsteps blending into a constant hum, but in that moment, everything felt still, like the next choice, whatever it would be, was about to define more than just the end of a flight, but the beginning of something she had not planned for, something that would test not just what he believed about people, but what she believed about herself. The noise of the terminal seemed to rush back all at once, like the world had been waiting for this exact moment to remind Sophie Bennett that whatever happened on that plane was not separate from reality, it was leading directly into it, and now she stood there, face to face with the truth she had not agreed to be part of. She looked at Alexander, really looked at him now, not as the calm stranger who had shared a flight with her, but as someone who had been watching, measuring, deciding, and the weight of that realization settled heavily in her chest. "You do not get to decide what I am worth based on a situation you created," she said, her voice steady, not raised, but firm enough that even the people standing around him shifted slightly, sensing the change in tone. Alexander did not interrupt. He did not defend himself immediately. He simply listened, and that, somehow, made it harder to stay angry in a clean, simple way. "I was not trying to decide your worth," he replied after a moment, his voice just as controlled, but softer now, less detached than before. "I was trying to understand it." Sophie shook her head slightly, her grip tightening on the strap of her bag. "That sounds like the same thing," she said. "You put me in a situation without telling me, you watched what I did, and now you are standing here telling me I passed some kind of test." She let out a small breath, the frustration not explosive, but deeply rooted. "I did not agree to be tested." The people around them were quiet now, their earlier urgency replaced by something more cautious, as if they understood that whatever this was, it mattered more than the schedule they were trying to keep. Alexander took a step closer, not enough to crowd her, but enough to close the distance that had formed between them. "You are right," he said simply. "You did not." The admission landed differently than she expected, not defensive, not dismissive, just honest, and for a second, Sophie did not know how to respond to that. "Then why?" she asked, her voice quieter now, but no less direct. "Why me?" Alexander glanced briefly at the people around him, then back at her, as if making a decision, and when he spoke again, there was no performance in his tone, no carefully crafted answer, just something real. "Because you were not trying to be anything other than yourself," he said. "Most people change the moment they think it matters. You did not." Sophie let out a small, almost disbelieving laugh, shaking her head. "You think I did not notice where I was sitting," she replied. "You think I was not aware that I did not belong there." "You noticed," he said. "But you did not let it change how you treated people." The words hit closer than she expected, and for a moment, she felt that familiar instinct to deflect, to minimize, to brush it off as nothing, but something stopped her this time. "That is not something you get credit for," she said instead. "That is just basic decency." Alexander held her gaze, a faint, almost sad smile appearing for a second. "You would be surprised how rare that is when people think there is nothing to gain," he said. Sophie looked away for a moment, the noise of the terminal filling the space between them again, announcements echoing overhead, footsteps moving past, life continuing whether she stayed in this moment or not, and she realized something then, something that made her chest tighten in a different way. This was not just about him testing people. This was about him expecting them to fail. "So what happens now?" she asked, turning back to him. "You got your answer. You got your footage. You prove whatever point you wanted to prove, and I just go to my interview like nothing happened." Alexander hesitated, and for the first time since she met him, there was uncertainty in his expression. "That depends on you," he said. Sophie frowned slightly. "On me?" "Yes," he replied. "Because I do not want this to end as just an observation." The words caught her off guard, and she studied him carefully, trying to understand what he meant, what he was offering, and more importantly, what it would cost her. "I have a foundation," he continued, his tone measured, but sincere. "We fund projects, ideas, people who see the world differently. People who act on values, not just opportunities." He paused, then added, "I think you could be one of those people." Sophie stared at him for a moment, the offer settling into place, and for a split second, it would have been easy to say yes, easy to accept the opportunity, the stability, the chance to finally stop struggling the way she always had, but something in her resisted, something that had been there long before this flight, long before him. "You think I need you to validate that?" she asked quietly. Alexander shook his head. "No," he said. "I think you already proved it." The answer disarmed her more than any argument could have, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the tension between them no longer sharp, but unresolved, like a question that had not yet been fully asked. Sophie took a slow breath, grounding herself, reminding herself of why she was here in the first place, the interview, the chance she had been chasing long before she ever stepped onto that plane. "I have somewhere to be," she said finally, her voice steady again. "And it has nothing to do with your experiment." Alexander nodded, not surprised, not offended, just accepting. I know, he said. That is why I am interested. Sophie studied him one last time, then adjusted her bag on her shoulder, turning slightly toward the flow of people moving through the terminal, but before she fully stepped away, she paused, glancing back at him. If you really want to understand people, she said, her tone calm but pointed, try talking to them without turning them into a test first. Then she walked away, not fast, not dramatic, just steady, moving forward into the uncertainty she had chosen for herself, leaving Alexander standing there with something he did not usually have, not control, not certainty, but a question that no amount of observation could answer for him. Sophie Bennett did not look back again as she walked through the terminal, her steps steady even though her thoughts were anything but, because every part of her wanted to stop, to turn around, to demand more answers, but a stronger part of her kept moving forward, the part that had carried her through every late night, every unpaid bill, every moment where she had to choose between what was easy and what was right. The airport felt louder now, brighter, filled with motion and purpose, and she blended into it quickly. Just another traveler with somewhere to be, someone trying to make something happen before time ran out. She checked the time on her phone, her heart tightening when she realized she had less than 2 hours before her interview, and the reality of that pressed in fast, replacing everything else with focus, with urgency, with the simple truth that whatever had happened on that plane could not matter more than what she had been working toward for years. Outside the terminal, the air hit differently, warmer, heavier, real in a way the controlled calm of the cabin never was, and Sophie stepped onto the curb, scanning for a bus, a taxi, anything she could afford that would get her across the city in time. A line of black cars waited nearby, drivers standing beside them in suits, holding signs for passengers whose lives looked very different from hers, and for a brief second, she thought about how easily she could have stepped into that world if she had said yes, if she had accepted what Alexander had offered without question, but the thought passed quickly, replaced by something steadier, something that felt more like her. She pulled her phone out again, opening the map, calculating the fastest route she could take with the little money she had, and just as she started toward the bus stop across the street, she heard her name. Sophie. She stopped, the sound cutting through the noise of the city with a clarity that made it impossible to ignore, and when she turned, Alexander was there, a few steps behind her, no entourage, no rush, just him, standing in a way that felt different from before, less controlled, more present. For a second, neither of them spoke, the moment hanging between them like something unfinished, and Sophie felt that same tension return, not sharp, but unresolved. You forgot something, he said, holding out her sketchbook. Her eyes widened slightly as she reached for it, realizing she must have left it behind in the seat, and the thought of losing it, of losing the one thing that held pieces of who she was when everything else felt uncertain, sent a quick wave of relief through her. Thank you, she said, her voice softer now, more grounded. And as she took it from him, her fingers brushed the cover instinctively, as if reassuring herself it was still there. Alexander nodded, but he did not step away this time. I meant what I said, he added, his tone quieter, more deliberate. Sophie met his gaze, her expression steady but guarded. About what? She asked, even though she already knew. About not wanting this to end as just an observation, he replied. Sophie exhaled slowly, glancing down at her sketchbook for a moment before looking back at him. You do not get to decide that either, she said. Some things just end. Alexander considered that, his expression thoughtful, and for the first time, there was no attempt to control the direction of the conversation, no subtle test hidden in his words. Then let me ask you something without turning it into a test, he said. Sophie raised an eyebrow slightly, waiting. What do you need right now? The question was simple, but it landed differently this time, because it did not feel like it was measuring her, it felt like it was offering space for her to answer honestly, without consequence, without expectation. Sophie hesitated, not because she did not know the answer, but because saying it out loud felt like admitting how close she was to the edge. I need to make it to my interview, she said finally. On time. Prepared. And not distracted by everything that just happened. Alexander nodded once, as if that answer made perfect sense to him. Then that is what matters, he said. Sophie studied him for a second, searching for the hidden layer, the part where this turned into something else, but it did not come. "You are not going to offer me a ride, or call someone, or make it easier?" she asked, a hint of challenge in her tone. Alexander shook his head slightly. "You already made it clear you do not want that," he replied. "And I respect that." The answer caught her off guard, not because it was surprising, but because it was exactly what she had asked for, even if she had not expected him to actually give it to her. "Good," she said after a moment, a small, almost reluctant smile appearing at the corner of her mouth. "Because I need to do this on my own." He returned the smile, faint but genuine. "I think you will," he said. For a second, it felt like the moment might stretch into something more, something that carried beyond this street, this city, this day, but Sophie knew better than to build expectations on something that had started as a mistake. She adjusted her bag, holding her sketchbook a little tighter now, then stepped back, creating the distance she needed. "Goodbye, Alexander," she said, her voice calm, final. "Goodbye, Sophie," he replied, and this time, neither of them tried to stop the ending from happening. Sophie turned and walked toward the bus stop, her steps quickening as the reality of time caught up with her again, and within moments, she was just another figure moving through the city, focused, determined, carrying everything she needed with her, including the part of herself that had not changed, even when everything around her had. Behind her, Alexander remained where he was for a few seconds longer, watching her disappear into the flow of people, and for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about what he had learned from the situation, but about what he had not been able to control, and somehow, that felt more important than any answer he had been searching for. The bus ride across the city was louder than Sophie Bennett expected, every stop punctuated by the hiss of brakes and the shuffle of people coming and going, but none of it fully reached her, because her mind was still replaying the last few hours in fragments, the questions, the tests, the way Alexander had looked at her when he said she was the answer, and she did not know whether to feel seen or studied, valued or evaluated, and that uncertainty stayed with her as she stepped off the bus. 3 blocks from the office building where her interview was scheduled. The building itself rose high above the street, glass reflecting the late afternoon light in a way that made everything feel just a little more intimidating, a little more out of reach, and Sophie paused at the corner for a second, adjusting her bag, steadying her breath, reminding herself why she was here long before any of this happened. She pushed through the revolving doors and into the lobby, where polished floors and quiet conversations filled the space with a kind of controlled confidence she had always found difficult to match, and she approached the reception desk with a calm she had practiced but never fully felt until now. "Hi, I am here for an interview," she said, her voice clear, her posture steady, and the receptionist smiled politely, checking her name against a list before handing her a visitor badge. "You are a little early. Have a seat. They will call you shortly." Sophie nodded, taking the badge, and moved to a chair near the window, her sketchbook resting on her lap as her fingers traced the edges absent-mindedly, grounding herself in something familiar as the minutes passed. Around her, other candidates sat in quiet anticipation, some reviewing notes, others scrolling through their phones, each one carrying their own version of hope, of pressure, of what this opportunity could mean, and Sophie realized she was no different, except for one thing. She had just been reminded that her value did not depend on whether she was chosen or not. When her name was finally called, she stood smoothly, following the hiring manager down a hallway lined with glass offices, her reflection appearing briefly beside her at every step, and for the first time, she did not look away from it. The interview room was simple, professional, a table, 2 chairs, a laptop open on one side, and the hiring manager gestured for her to sit. "Tell me about yourself," he said, the question familiar, expected, but this time, Sophie did not reach for a rehearsed answer. She took a small breath and spoke honestly, about her work, her struggles, the freelance projects that kept her going, the nights she spent drawing when no one was asking her to, and the way she believed design was not just about making things look good, but about making people feel seen. The conversation shifted naturally from there, questions and answers flowing without the usual tension, because Sophie was no longer trying to prove she belonged in a room like this, she was simply showing who she already was, and that difference, subtle as it was, changed Everything. Across town, in a glass conference room high above the city, Alexander Cole stood at the head of a table, his team gathered around him, screens displaying clips from the flight, moments carefully captured, edited, framed for impact, and yet as they spoke about timing, release strategy, audience engagement, he found his attention drifting, not to the metrics, not to the potential reach, but to the way Sophie had walked away, steady, certain, choosing her own path without hesitation. "We can launch tonight," one of his team members said, pointing to a timeline on the screen. "The narrative is strong. Authentic. It will resonate." Alexander nodded slightly, but his response was delayed, measured. "Hold it," he said finally. The room fell quiet. "Hold it," another voice repeated. "Yes," he said, his tone calm but final. "This is not ready." There were exchanged glances, confusion, but no one challenged him directly. "What is missing?" someone asked. Alexander looked at the paused frame on the screen, Sophie handing him his wallet back, unaware of everything surrounding that moment, and for the first time, he saw it differently, not as proof of a point, but as something incomplete. "Context," he said. "Without it, it is just another story about what people do when they are being watched." He turned away from the screen, his mind already moving ahead, not toward the next test, but toward something he had not done before, something that required more than observation. Back in the interview room, Sophie leaned forward slightly as the hiring manager asked one final question. "Why should we choose you?" he said. Sophie paused, not because she did not have an answer, but because she understood now that the question itself did not define her. "You should not choose me because I need this," she said calmly. "You should choose me because I will bring something real to your team. And if that is not what you are looking for, then this is not the right place for me." The room went quiet for a second, the kind of quiet that did not signal doubt, but consideration, and when the hiring manager finally nodded, there was a different kind of respect in his expression. Outside, the sun had begun to lower, casting long shadows across the city, and somewhere between two very different buildings, two very different worlds, something had shifted in both of them, not because of what had been tested, but because of what had been chosen, and neither Sophie nor Alexander fully understood yet how those choices were about to come back together in a way neither of them had planned. The interview room felt quieter than before as Sophie Bennett stepped out into the hallway, the door closing softly behind her, and for a moment she just stood there, her hand still lightly resting against the strap of her bag, her heart beating in a steady rhythm that was no longer driven by fear but by something stronger, something she had not fully recognized until now, a sense of certainty that no matter what happened next, she had shown up as herself, and that alone meant more than any outcome waiting on the other side of a decision she could not control. The hiring manager's final nod lingered in her mind, not as a guarantee, but as acknowledgement, and as she walked back through the lobby, past the same polished floors and quiet conversations, everything looked just a little different, not because the building had changed, but because she had. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast a warm glow across the street, and Sophie stepped onto the sidewalk, taking a slow breath, letting the city noise settle around her, grounding her in the moment, in the now, in the space between what had been and what was about to come. She checked her phone, no missed calls, no messages, just the same quiet screen that had followed her through every uncertain step, and she smiled faintly, not disappointed, not anxious, just ready. Across the street, a small cafe caught her attention, the kind of place where people sat by the window with laptops and notebooks, where conversations were low and unhurried, and without overthinking it, she crossed the street and stepped inside, ordering the simplest thing on the menu, a cup of coffee, and finding a seat near the window where the light fell just right across her sketchbook as she placed it on the table in front of her. For a few minutes, she just sat there, watching people pass by, letting everything settle, letting the weight of the day find its place inside her, and then, almost instinctively, she opened her sketchbook, flipping to the unfinished skyline she had been working on during the flight. Her pencil moved slowly at first, then with more confidence, filling in the spaces she had left blank, adding light where there had only been outlines, shaping something that felt closer to complete, and as she worked, she realized she was no longer drawing a place she wished she belonged, she was drawing a place she could build, piece by piece, in her own way. The bell above the cafe door chimed softly, but Sophie did not look up right away, too focused on the lines forming beneath her hand, until a familiar voice spoke gently from across the table. "That one looks different." She paused, her pencil hovering mid-air, then slowly lifted her gaze, and there he was, Alexander Cole, standing there without the distance of a plane seat or the noise of an airport between them, just a man in a quiet cafe, looking at her work with genuine interest. Sophie leaned back slightly, studying him for a second, not surprised exactly, but not expecting him either. "It is," she said simply. "It is not about where I want to be anymore." He nodded, taking a seat across from her without asking, but not assuming either, just present in the moment. "Then what is it about?" he asked. Sophie glanced down at the page, then back at him. "Where I am willing to build," she replied. The words settled between them, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet of the cafe wrapping around them like a pause in everything that had come before. "I did not release the footage," Alexander said after a while, his tone calm, but deliberate. Sophie raised an eyebrow slightly, not defensive, just curious. "Why not?" she asked. He leaned back slightly, considering his answer. "Because it was not the full story," he said. "And I am starting to think the parts that matter most are the ones you cannot capture on camera." Sophie watched him for a second, searching for the familiar layer of analysis, of testing, but it was not there. Or at least, not in the same way. "So what happens now?" she asked, echoing the question she had asked him before, but this time, it felt different, less like a challenge, more like an open possibility. Alexander met her gaze, steady, honest. "Now I try something I have not done before," he said. "I ask instead of test." Sophie considered that, a small smile forming at the corner of her lips, not because she was convinced, but because she recognized the effort. "And what are you asking?" she said. He hesitated for just a second, not out of uncertainty, but out of respect for the weight of the moment. "I am asking if you would be willing to work with me," he said. "Not because you passed something, but because you showed me something I was not looking for." Sophie leaned back slightly, her fingers resting lightly on her sketchbook, the offer settling into place, and for a moment, it would have been easy to say yes immediately, to step into a world that could offer her security, opportunity, a different path, but she did not rush it, not this time. "If I say yes," she said slowly, "it is not because you chose me." She held his gaze, steady, clear. "It is because I am choosing what I can become." Alexander nodded, a quiet understanding passing between them. "That is the only reason I would want," he said. The city outside continued moving, people passing by, lives unfolding in countless directions, but inside that small cafe, something settled into place, not a perfect ending, not a guaranteed future, but a beginning built on something real, something chosen, and as Sophie looked down at her sketchbook one more time, she realized that the seat she had taken by mistake had not changed who she was, it had simply revealed it, and now, for the first time, she was ready to decide where that version of herself would go next.